Hello, Anna.
Hi, Alex.
Thank you for coming to the RIB room, the Roman Inscriptions of Britain room. We've been looking at some of these amazing notebooks by Collingwood. This one dates to 1929, and he's beautifully drawn out some of these inscriptions on stone that he can see around Britain. But in a lot of these notebooks, there's also non-lapidary inscriptions, so inscriptions on much smaller objects. So tell me about writing, sort of everyday writing for Romans. How would a Roman write a postcard or a shopping list?
There were two main techniques of everyday writing in Roman time, and one was to scratch into a surface, and the other one is to write with ink. And of course, at the time, there wasn't mass-produced paper. There would have been papyrus and also parchment, but neither of these materials would have been very readily available to everyone everywhere in the empire. But people also wrote with ink onto such leaf tablets, as we call them, very thin sheets of wood that could also be bent and bound together. And these are particularly well known from Vindolanda up at Hadrian's Wall, because the soil condition there it's a very moist soil, so it preserves organic material really well. And these tablets were used for all kinds of writing, such as letters or military reports, accounts, anything that you can think of, really. So
this replica is kind of interesting, isn't it? Because this one shows part of a letter, and this is particularly cool because we think it's been added by a woman. So it's one of the first examples where a segment we think of female writing has been definitely positively identified.
Yes, that's right. So this is the very famous birthday invitation from Sulpicia Lepidina, the wife of the commander, to Claudia Sebera to invite her to her birthday. And we think that it was written by maybe a servant and then signed by Sulpicia herself in her own handwriting, which is very nice. So this kind of leaf tablet would have been one way to send a postcard at the time. And another candidate could be a wooden wax tablet like this one, which had a recess that was filled with wax. And then it would have been inscribed with a stylus like this one, in imperial time, usually made of metal. This may seem like a bit of a strange material for us to write into, but it has quite a few advantages. So with this eraser end, the writing could be erased, so the tablet could be reused. And also by forming what we call a diptych or even a polyptych, by using several of these tablets and binding them together, the writing would have been protected, and it could also be sealed. They were used for legal documents as well. We know this because some of these preserve writing underneath the wax, where it is scratched into the wood.
So that's someone writing really hard and they've accidentally gone right through the wax and
yes,
they didn't mean to write into the sort of back plate, as it were, of the...
Probably not. That's something that we're still trying to think about more and find out exactly how that happened, because it's actually not that easy to write into the wood, I found out. It's quite hard. It has to be a very thin layer of wax.
And the wax here, so it's beeswax?
Yes, it's beeswax, and they would have mixed it with different kinds of substances. So they would have had red wax and also blackened wax like this one. This replica used soot to make the wax black, and we know that was used in at least one of the Bloomberg wax tablets.
They also use like carbonized bone.
Exactly, yes. And that would have also altered the consistency a bit more of this wax. I've been trying to learn a bit more about how these tablets were inscribed and erased as well.
And I can read, you've put in what looks like old Roman cursive here, something like, there's some squiggles at the beginning, and then it says ad revum, and then you've repeated ad revum, and then eundem.
Yes,
but,
that's right.
I mean, I have to say, this is harder to read than ink or biro on paper. Like, it doesn't feel that easy to read. Is that how you'd see it? Or?
Yes, I would, and I'm not the only one. We know that Quintilian, who was a rhetoric teacher in Rome in the 1st century CE, he wrote a book about the education of an orator, and he says that writing in ink is easier because it is more legible compared to these wax tablets. But it is true, it's not that easy to read. There isn't a lot of contrast, and I think it depends on the lighting. If you find a good angle, you can actually read it quite easily. And it would also depend on the instruments you use.
I mean, I absolutely love this one. This one, I know this one. This is a Vindolanda pen, so-called, isn't it?
Yes.
So tell me about, I mean, it looks like a weapon. Tell me about what we think that was used for.
They're called Vindolanda pens, but they're also found in other sites in Europe. We know that they were used with ink in Vindolanda because there was remains of ink were found on this metal coil.
Actually, on the nib and on the wood.
Exactly. Yeah. So we know that they were used for ink, but what's a bit puzzling is that these generally don't have a split nib, which we think the Vindolanda tablets, they were written with a split nib. So there's a bit of a mystery. And some of these are quite big as well. And they've actually it's been suggested that they were ox goads.
So used for poking oxen to get them to do things?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, quite a different function.
Very, yes. But I think we can think more generally of them as just maybe a way of making a stylus-like or a pen-like instrument with less metal. And then for various purposes, perhaps for marking wood, a wood carver could have used that, or even for marking lead, metal, bronze, whatever.
So tell me about these ink pots and ink. What was the ink made of, and which pen would I have chosen to write a Vindolanda tablet like this? Perhaps this one, but could I have used this one?
Yes, if you had the money to have one of these.
Okay.
These are quite expensive. This is a replica of a copper alloy bronze pen. These are very rare finds. Mainly in Roman antiquity, people would have used reed pens like this one.
Calamus.
A calamus,
Yeah,
exactly.
right.
And quills actually are not attested before the 6th or 7th century. So
right, okay.
They
So
would not have used feathers. No feathers. These actually look quite similar, the nibs, to our modern ink pens. But a big difference, of course, is that these wouldn't have had the kind of ink reservoirs that we have nowadays. So they would have had to dip them into the ink quite frequently.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that Quintilian didn't like about the ink pen, because he says that it stops the train
flow,
of thought.
Right.
Yes.
Okay, that's really interesting. So all this chat about ink, and I'm just thinking about how messy that might have been without a reservoir in the pen, has got me thinking about the experience of writing in the Roman world. So how do we envisage, Cicero getting up in the morning and going to his going to his writing equipment to start work?
With Cicero, we know that he would have dictated a lot of his work to a servant, and this must have been the case for many of the more well-known writers. But still, he would have been literate himself, of course, and able to write a letter himself. In any case, either the servant or the writer themselves, if they were using ink, they may have had to mix their ink for the day. And then we don't actually see in the depictions of people writing. So we get these on mainly on funerary monuments. We don't ever see them really sitting down at a desk, but they are sat and they have their writing equipment on their knees. So the papyrus on their knees, or the tablet on their knees. They may also have been standing up and holding the tablet in their hand while writing. And these are quite interesting things to think about when we try to learn more about the practicalities of writing and about how these implements would have been used and made and performed. Because when you have to hold the tablet in your hand you may want to choose a smaller one, perhaps, depending on how you hold the pen. Maybe the nib would be used or worn down in a different way if you hold it in a different angle, because you can't rest your hand on the papyrus. So these are really interesting things to think about, and I think it's only towards the late Roman period and the end of the Roman period where we start to see evidence for desks being used to write on.
Okay. Now that lovely bronze replica keeps catching my eye, and what you were saying earlier about, you know, your average person would not have had access to this kind of pen. It's got me thinking about the kind of social status of writing in the Roman world, and it comes up quite a lot on tombstones and other iconographic representations, doesn't it? In a way that, you know, we probably wouldn't put some pens on our funerary monuments now. What's your take on those things?
Yes, so yeah, it's true. We wouldn't probably put a pen or even take it into our grave, perhaps. Although I think still people have quite an emotional attachment sometimes to particular pens. I know I do.
You really like your pens.
I do. I have a special one for special occasions. But in Roman time, I think there was a specific meaning to writing and writing equipment as well, because it represented education, it represented status and wealth that resulted from education. It could also just be tied to a profession. So we have some examples where a teacher, for example, or a surveyor, someone using writing equipment regularly in their everyday life, had them put on their funerary monument. And in some areas, of course, of the empire, being able to write also meant knowing Latin as well. And for some individuals, it would have been quite important to show off that they know that they have this ability.
There are several graves known from the Roman world where you have a collection of writing equipment actually in the grave. And am I right in thinking that that's been really helpful, and also when collections are represented on tombstones as well, for actually even just identifying some implements, because in some cases archaeologists were not really sure when they were found on sites. I mean, we're not talking about styluses, but there were some other bits and pieces where people were not really sure whether they were writing equipment at all. Is there a good example of that you could mention?
Yes, one good example is actually the wax spatula. People didn't really know what to make of it. They thought maybe it could be a razor blade or some kind of tool that would have been hammered on.
Oh yeah, it does. Yeah, for stoneworking or something.
Neither of these interpretations were consistent with the wear on these objects, for example. And they were then recognised as wax spatulas, or identified as wax spatulas, in part because they were depicted together with writing equipment on funerary monuments, and also on in frescoes from the Vesuvian towns.
So am I right in thinking that, so if you have the styluses like this, they have the little mini erasers, so you're going to use that to make your correction if you've made a small mistake, and is the point of these bigger ones that this is for dealing with renewing the whole tablet? And would you, I mean, I've tried this before after using these on teaching expeditions, that it is quite messy and hard. And would they have warmed up the blade to kind of slide through the wax better? How would they have done it? Do we have any idea?
Yes, I think they could have been used to make a tabula rasa, so to erase the whole tablet. And if people had heat available, they would have probably used it, because it makes it a lot easier. But it can be done without heat as well.
I'm just thinking, I feel as if I know this idea about erasing using the spatula from you and your research. Is it not actually the case that until you've looked into this, most people were thinking that actually spatulae were used to scrape out wax when the tablet needed to be refilled?
Yes, that's right. That's generally what is assumed. And it could have definitely been done like this. just scrape everything out and put a new fill in. We don't have a lot of evidence for repeated scraping in the wood where tablets have been preserved. But it could have served definitely for refilling the tablet, and it could have helped with refilling the tablet. So if you pour new wax in, I've tried that too, and then you can use this square end to spread the wax into the corners of the tablet.
So you think it was actually the square end of the spatula that might have been used to do the smoothing of a new layer? That's really interesting.
Yeah, it could have been. It needs to be very hot though, and not all spatulae have this kind of square end.
No, right. Some have goddesses on the end, which are not going to be so effective at this smoothing process.
That's right.
Well, thank you, Anna, so much for talking to me about writing equipment and for telling me about the results of your experimental archaeology. I can't wait to hear more as your research on this progresses.
Thank you very much.